hair, black skin, black queen, stand majestic with the black king. Today I'll sing you a black song. You need to hear about beautiful black things, cause most times we hear about black, we hear about black magic and black witches. Black list, black book, black market, Black Friday, spend off your black riches. I've never seen a doctor in black, nor seen a black pill for cure no black people. But I've seen bush doctors like Tosh and Marley resurrect like a real black meter. Malcolm, Marcus, Martin. When you see Walter Rodney, ask him. Oh, you not hear about how we laughed in. So when the little offspring asking, tell them they never told us that black is beautiful. They never told us no, that black is beautiful. They never told us black is beautiful. They never told us. They never told us that black is beautiful, no.
Hello and welcome to the 6th presentation in the UE Mona Western Jamaica Campus Research Seminar Series. I am your host, and this afternoon's presentation will be the third four-semester tour, an initiative of our campus director, Professor Donovan Campbell. The Research Seminar Series is an activity geared towards providing a platform for faculty, students, academics in the wider community to share their work, their wealth of knowledge, and their ideas. The presenter today is Dr. Kirt Henry. He's a Jamaican-born thinker, curator, researcher, writer, and advocate for the research, documentation, and preservation of African-Jamaican culture. He is a director of the African-Caribbean Institute of Jamaica at the Jamaica Memory Bank. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in History and Heritage Studies and a Doctor of Philosophy in Cultural Studies from the University of the West Indies. He has served as an adjunct lecturer at UE Mona, where he has taught courses on African religious retention, Caribbean fashion, and material culture studies. As a cultural scholar, he uses his platforms to create an environment which promotes appreciation, respect, and tolerance for gender, historical, political, religious, and cultural differences amongst his audiences. And this, he believes, is the foundation of community and nation building. Dr. Henry currently serves as a consultant to the Jamaica-Wales Alliance Group for the Reparations Project in Pennant, Clarendon. In 2023, he received the Governor General's Achievement Award in recognition of his significant leadership. He is also the recipient of the 2022 Prime Minister's National Youth Awards for Excellence in Academics. He was also given the Dean's Award for Excellence in the Faculty of Humanities and Education, where, being conferred with the Doctor of Philosophy in Cultural Studies, he achieved it with high commendation. Dr. Henry participated as an author in the British Academy's writing program and served as a curatorial fellow in the Afro-Caribbean Art Program in New York City. He uses his research to contribute to community development and empowering Jamaicans with the knowledge necessary to become culturally aware and responsible citizens. He will present the topic, Decolonizing Madness, Race, Religion, and Power in Jamaica. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kirt Henry.
Thank you, Dr. Obika. It is my pleasure to be here this afternoon. Let me say a pleasant afternoon to the audience and to those joining online. I wish to thank the organizing team of these seminars for inviting me here to deliver my lecture on the topic or the question of decolonizing madness, especially in the context of African-Jamaican spiritualities. Before I go any further, I must caution those of you viewing that certain, particular primary information that I will be sharing this afternoon may be triggering to some folks. So I caution you where that is concerned. Now, what I will share with you today is not a fully developed argument. What I intend to put forward are my preliminary reasonings on the old question of madness. In this intellectual engineering, my thoughts on the topic have been shaped by scholars such as Franz Fanon, Michel Foucault, Frederick Hicklin, the North American scholar, Dr. Joy DeGruy, and more recently, Dave Goss and Sonia Stanley Nair. Now, building on these scholars, the trajectory of this study may seem apparent in terms of my exploration of political manifestation in which behavior and reason are indicative of one's oppressive structures. However, in my own madness, I wish to explore not only the politics of madness, but also the relationship between madness and African-Jamaican spirituality. Additionally, I wish to explore the question of how colonial classifications, perceptions, narratives, and structures not only criminalized, but also influence and shape our understanding, treatment, experiences, and attitudes towards African-Jamaican spiritual expressions as ultimately madness. On the other hand, I attempt to examine how, in a post-colonial context, madness is redefined, embodied, and performed by African-Jamaicans in opposition to colonialism. And I will hasten to say that it is quite an interesting time that I'm doing this lecture, particularly because today, actually, is the eve of the Coral Gardens massacre, which happened in 1962, right? Where men and women of the Rastafari community was beaten and imprisoned, right? So it's interesting that we are continuing this conversation. Today's topic is particularly of particular interest to me, not only because I am a revivalist, but because of the urgent need for us to push forward the conversation or policies pertaining to reparations. Now, I will focus this presentation on two main themes. One, I will look at madness as a result of and a response to colonial structures. Now, in my examining of madness as a result of enslavement and colonialism, it's important for me to go back to the Middle Passage and to examine cases of insanity on board the ships. It's also important for me to interrogate plantation life as a dehumanizing experience, and I will look at laws put forward to implicate and, of course, erase expressions of African spirituality in the island. I will also focus on the perceptions of madness and also the definitions of madness. The second part of the presentation will focus on madness in response to colonialism. So madness not only a cause or a result of enslavement, but also madness redefined by our people in response to colonialism. Now, there are two very important scholars that I want to introduce to you today. These are one, you're looking at Dr. Joy DeGruy. She is the author of the book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. We've heard about post-traumatic stress disorder, right? She looked at post-traumatic slave syndrome. And her book argues that the experience of slavery in the United States in particular, and the continued discrimination and oppression endured by African Americans create intergenerational trauma, leading to a psychological and behavioral syndrome common among present-day African Americans, manifesting as a lack of self-esteem, present feelings of anger, and internalized racist beliefs. The other scholar I wish to put forward is no stranger to us, but the late Frederick Hickling, and he talks primarily about madness as a legacy of violence in Jamaica, which emerged from the experiences of colonialism and enslavement. And he looked at issues of complex trauma within our society. And the symptoms of those are, as a result of sexual abuse, physical, emotional abuse, emotional neglect, issues of war, terrorism, and forced migration. And I will say here that the context in which this presentation is being delivered, we have to reflect on the fact that the birth of Jamaica was on the foundations of violence. Yes, from the coming of the Spanish right throughout slavery, leading to emancipation and even after. Now, Frederick Hickling talks about the result of this complex trauma, yes? And the symptoms of that, he says, are a sense of threat avoidance and re-experiencing, interpersonal disturbance, negative self-respect, which we see manifestations of that in our society today by virtue of practices as it relates to skin bleaching, self-loathing, and so on. Now, madness as a result of enslavement and colonialism. Now, I find this quote to be very interesting by Achille Mbembe, and he says that colonialism is a factory in which madness is manufactured. And I'll go into that further in the presentation. Now, the Middle Passage or the transatlantic slave trade is quite important in my understanding of madness. And what you are looking at is a compilation of minutes that was published in 1790. And it's a document I found within the archives at the University of Wales. And this document actually records testimonies given by enslavers on board the ships and also medical professionals on board the ships as well. The highlighted section, the interviewer asked, "Do you believe the despondency of the slaves arising from their frustration ever produces madness?" The response is, "We had a case on board of a man who came on board apparently well, but shortly after became to look pensive and melancholy. A certain degree of wildness appeared in his countenance. He began to eat his food voraciously, and sometimes as insensible what it was. At other times he refused it entirely. At length he became noisy and made us of an expression. And more, the person being in general called upon to take the slaves out of the irons when necessary. He continued to disturb the ship's company and the slaves for a considerable time, and at length he died insane." Now, we have to take into account the dehumanization of enslaved Africans. And this is a testimony where it records the fact that slaves were ritualistically forced into cannibalism. This account given by James, quoted in Clinton Hutton's work, African-Caribbean Spirituality and Creativity, it says, one eyewitness on a slaver tells us that the captain of a ship, to strike fear into the rest, killed a slave and dividing his heart, liver, and entrails into 300 pieces, made each of the slaves eat one, threatening those who refused with the same torture. Such incidents were not rare. In an account given by Dr. Alexander, who was on board one of the slave ships called Alexander, he was asked the question, to what cause do you ascribe the insanity of these instances? He replied, to their being torn from their nearest connections and carried away from their country. And with these primary sources, I make haste to say that these are the sort of traumatic situations in which African enslaved peoples were forced under. And of course, there's evidence to show that situations such as this will cause to psychological and mental harm. The plantation itself, as I described, was a crucible for the emergence of black inferiority. Most of us may know about the famous diary written by Thomas Thistlewood, and he wrote in his diary on July 1756 what he ordered done to Port Royal, an enslaved man for the crime of running away from enslavement on the plantation. Thistlewood wrote, they gave him a moderate whipping, pickled him well, and made Hector shit in his mouth, immediately put in a gag whilst his mouth was full, and made him wear it 4 to 5 hours. And these are some of the cases of situations that happened on the plantation. There was an important process on the plantation called seasoning. Now, seasoning by Orlando Pattison, he described this as a process where the adjustment of the African to his slave status on the plantation. Buckridge says that the stripped individual is not only humbled, humiliated, and weakened, but vulnerable and accessible to exploitation. Seasoning was popularly being done as a psychological process to strip the enslaved African of his identity, of his history, of his culture, and of his religion. It is stated that 7 to 50% of the slaves are estimated to have died within 1 to 7 years of the seasoning period. Now, seasoning, the main aim of this, especially in the plantation system, was for productivity. And if you recall that our people by law were not considered to be human beings, but rather chattel or property belonging to the masters. And the seasoning process in particular was to ensure the creation of docile minds and bodies. Now, cultural erasure was a common phenomenon on the sugar plantations, and it ensured a disconnect with Africa as the source of our identity. And of course, African culture and history for a very long time has been viewed as backward, uncivilized, and barbaric by the colonial masters. Of course, there was a movement to suppress spiritual expressions and freedoms. These were seen in the banning of instruments, the policing of bodily movement and gathering, of course, the stripping away of the African language, with the English language being forced. Now, these are some legislations that were passed in Jamaica. And for your information, Jamaica was viewed as one of the most brutal places that slavery took place. Now, in 1688, we saw the banning of drums and horns, after which followed by the Act of 1760, which is to remedy evils arising from irregular assemblies of slaves. And of course, they feared assembly of slaves because they were of the opinion that once we gathered, it was for purposes of revolt. The 1760 Taki Rebellion is important because that rebellion made way for the banning of obeah on the plantations that we will come to after, which was passed in 1898 and is still in effect today. Importantly, the lunatic law was passed in 1861. So in essence, anyone charged with a felony was immediately sent to the lunatic asylum as opposed to a prison. Now, we may know about the story of Alexander Bedward, where Alexander Bedward, he was sent to a lunatic asylum on the grounds of the 1861 law. However, because there was an amendment in 1885 which required that a medical examination would have to be done for you to send someone to a lunatic asylum. And based on that, Alexander Bedward's lawyer was able to get him out of the asylum until the state found another way of sending him back to the asylum where he died a couple of years after. Now, there's the medical law of 1908, and this, of course, was to control those of the obeah practitioners who were involved in folk medicine and contributed to the healing of the people in Jamaica. This is important because if you know, in the 1850s in Jamaica, there was a severe case of diseases surfacing, and of course, our people were not given sufficient medical attention. And contrary to the notion that we have of obeah today, obeah in that time served a completely different purpose, in which the obeah men and women served as doctors for Africans ailing from particular diseases. In 1931, you have the Revivalism and Shakerism bill, where there was the argument being made that revivalism contributed to lunacy within our environment, and therefore there was a move to outlaw or prohibit the practice of revivalism in Jamaica. Then, of course, because of the drumming and chanting and singing by African expressions or African religious groups, there was the Noise Abatement Act, right, being enforced in 1997. And so we have a long history of not only a violent society, but a criminalization of a group of people because of their race. Now, there was a categorization of African spiritual traditions generally. So within the Obeah Act, which is quite ambiguous, and what scholars would describe as an empty concept, African religious expressions were criminalized, right, and viewed largely as barbaric, uncivilized, evil, superstitious, pagan, dangerous, ignorant, foolishness, moral deterioration, which leads to a breakdown of good conscience and family life, a threat to the British social order, and of course, obeah, witchcraft, noise, and so on. So all of these categorizations of African spirituality assist in shaping our perception of African religions here in Jamaica. The average man will tell you about obeah, but if you ask him to identify or define obeah, there is no real definitive answer being given, because that is what the law did, which was to group everything identified as African spirituality as obeah. Now, there are perceptions of madness within our society. Madness is usually defined in terms of its attributes. So a madman is expected to be dirty, disruptive, uncontrollable, foolish, unpredictable, sometimes violent, to be feared, and of course the amusement of the insane person. Where even on the plantation, madness was seen as a spectacle on the plantations, right? There are spatial features, where it is believed that madmen are usually in the mental hospital or on the streets. So there's the other attribute in terms of mad people do mad things. So I don't know how many of you have ever done something and the question is asked, you're mad? Right? Yes. So those are some of the attributes as it relates to madness. Madness is usually seen as permanent and contagious and pervasive. And of course, as we go further within the laws and a certain communication, I will show you where the belief of lunacy being contagious came from. Of course, madness results from causes, from a multiplicity of causes. These are excessive studying. Have you ever heard the term, you study too much, you get mad? Right. Due to worry, stress, due to wickedness and devil possession, right? And religious excitement, particularly obia. Now, within African spirituality and within Haitian voodoo, of course, madness is often seen as a means of discipline by the spirit, for example. Voodoo is usually used for social sanction, and especially in parts of Western Africa, where there is no formal government per se, only the spiritual leaders who would provide governance for the people. And oftentimes the spirit was an intervening factor which served as jury and judge within those particular cases. And there's a belief within African spirituality that whenever a person is mad, what happens is that the spirit of the person leaves the body, leaving the shell to roam around. Because it is believed that it is your spirit that really gives you your personality. And once that spirit is taken away, once your personality is taken away, then it leaves the body to roam. Now, there's the politics of ethnosemantics, and what I mean by this is really particular terms that are used to describe a particular group of people. Is that clear? All right, so Goss, in his recently published book on Alexander Bedward, stated that a byproduct of colonialism is the dissemination of lies and propaganda by the colonial state and its allies as an important measure in maintaining colonial rule. The language of the powerful elite usually becomes the normal discourse in society. Now, Steve Buckridge, in his book, The Language of Dress, talks about the importance of terminologies, yes? And using certain words and phrases to describe what we do and use to identify our people. Now, redefining terms to represent the reality and truth of the victims in light of the fact that concepts are often redefined in structures of stereotypes, yes, and colonial biases in the Caribbean experience. Now, we must look at the difference in using terms such as master and planter versus enslaver. You see, are you picturing the difference between using master versus enslaver? Because enslaver now puts in context the reality of what the individual was during the time of enslavement. And so it's a similar case between the use of slave versus enslaved, right? And there are those people who tell you that slavery existed in Africa. Well, actually, yes, it's a fact. Slaves existed in Africa because despite of being confined, they were still offered basic human rights, yes? But however, in chattel slavery, where the African now become enslaved, his humanity was stripped away, taken away from him. And of course, I mentioned earlier this story of Alexander Bedward. And Bedward was largely incarcerated because of his narratives which were against the colonial state. And of course, the government at the time, the colonial government at the time, could not allow for any form of anti-rhetoric being done against the state, right? The government feared a revolution among the people. And so Bedward was incarcerated. And of course, they feared Bedwardism, because Bedwardism was a movement where thousands of Jamaicans were convicted in the cause of championing their own freedom, their own autonomy, and the right to self-government, and so on. And of course, Bedwardism was also in areas such as Panama and in other areas. So it was an international movement that the state needed to control. And one way of doing that was to render Alexander Bedward as a madman. And so we've heard stories of Marcus Garvey himself being termed a madman. And at one point, our very own Bob Marley was being viewed as a madman because of his ideologies that go against the state. Now, I want to turn my attention now to revivalism. How many of you have heard the term Pocomania being used? Pocomania, or Poco people, right? And normally when you mention revivalism, the first term that comes to mind is Poco. And the question is, why is that the dominant narrative? Even though that revivalists do not identify themselves or describe themselves as Pocomania, why is that still within our psyche as a group of people? And it is so where Dave Goss spoke about earlier, that the language of the colonial elite is normally the dominant language within our society. Edward Seaga, as in his capacity as a structural anthropologist, sought to deconstruct the colonial term Pocomania. And he says, of course, that Poco in its Spanish derivative, meaning a little, and mania, madness. So again, going back in history, we could see where madness has been used as a tool, yes, to suppress and oppress particular groups of people, right? Now, Seaga, in his deconstruction, came up with the notion that it is not actually Pocomania, that Pocomania is a bastardization of Pocomina. And he said Pocomina because there are groups of revivalists that use Kumina within certain rituals that they have, right? So the merging of two spiritual forms. Now, Nathaniel Murrell, in his book, contributed to this debate and says that Poco, he sees Poco as a corruption of the Hindi word puka, which means reality or real, yes? Or to its Twi origin, po, which means shaking and trembling, and come, dancing wildly, which were words used to describe revivalists. Now, as a cultural studies scholar, we have to remain silent where the group is silent. In other words, you will not find a revivalist describing him or herself as a Poco. And therefore, as scholars with a responsibility to empower the people, we should try our best to stay away from particular terms that further marginalizes people. Am I making sense? Yes, because we have a responsibility as intellectuals, yes, to empower the very people that we write about and often present in our books and articles and so on. Madness as a political response to enslavement and colonialism. I've stated previously in the lecture, giving you evidence where colonialism and enslavement contributed to the destabilization of the mentality of the black man. But however, I will now share with you how the concept of madness being redefined has been used by particular groups of people to challenge the state. And these groups are the revivalists, yes, the Bedouinites, the Rastafari, which emerged in the 1930s and so on. Now, a little bit about revivalism. It's a postmodern African-Jamaican religion that emerged in the early 1860s during the Great Revival, which is said to have started in Europe. And what happened during this period, you had mass confessions of people falling on the ground, confessing their sins, going to church religiously. There are accounts within the records in the Jamaica archives which describes the Moravian church. You know, there's a growth in population of people, of backsliders returning to the church, and so on. So it was an interesting time. So Jamaica's revival emerged in response to domination and conflict, a desire to construct alternative identities and realities outside of the identity of the oppressors. I must say that the term revivalism is not unique to Jamaica. There are several revivals that took place across the region. And of course, what revivalism is a return or a revisiting of a current structure or ideology. Yes? And we see that the revivalism that happened in 1860s in Jamaica, it was a space within which African Jamaicans started to reincorporate and reintroduce particular forms of their spirituality within the umbrella of Christianity. Now, Santosh says that movements of religious revivalism connotes both political and spiritual defiance. And of course, there is this very interesting quote taken from Stead's work in his book called The Revival in the West, where he attributes the revival to both social and political reform. He says that there are certain phenomena which precede and which follow the revival of religion. The symptoms premonitory of revival are the phenomena of death, corruption, and decay. It is the darkest hour before the dawn. The nation always seems to be given over to the evil one before the coming of the Son of Man. The atheism of the well-to-do, the brutality of the masses, the reign of evil becomes intolerable. Then the soul of the nation awakens. And so this quote by Stead provides an interesting background into my own argument in terms of him describing the situation of a society before a revival happens. So he says that the society will get to the peak of evil before there's an awakening in your consciousness to turn away. However, during the revival, I'm arguing that there was an awakening within the African psyche in terms of reclaiming, repairing, and returning to his former identity, which would have been taken away on the plantation. And the revival happened, 22 years after emancipation ended. So, of course, the system of enslavement would have still been etched in the consciousness of the people during that time. And so they used the revival of the 1860s as a political strategy, yes, to return to their identity. Some scholars argue that the claim that revivalism is a mix of African and Christian, they actually adopted Christianity as a means of masking their African spirituality. And of course, there are references made to particular religions like Voodoo in Haiti, Candomblé, Santeria in Cuba, and so on. Now, what is the significance of revivalism? The revival of the 1860s was not a demonstration of insanity, as seen in the minds and legislation of the colonizers, but rather a reclamation and celebration of African spirituality. Madness, therefore, is regarded as a socio-political condition in which the ideological structures and foundations of colonialism are disrupted. The revival of the 1860s gave rise to other forms of religion and political movements such as Bedouinism, Ethiopianism, and Rastafari. So the phenomena of the revival was quite important in that regard. And also talk about the revolutionary phenomenon in which African Jamaicans exercise great autonomy in challenging their oppressors. And so the revival of the 1860s emerged with a kind of revisionist philosophy where African Jamaicans started to be conscious of their situation and challenge the colonial masters. Now, this is a photo of a procession to the healing stream that Alexander Bedward, and you see the amount of people there. And so it is because of this, the mass of people following Bedward that the state felt threatened. Now, revivalism and lunacy, I'll wrap up shortly. Now, during the 1800s and the 1930s saw a rise in community associations and parochial boards, as we know them, parish councils today, calling for the suppression of revivalism through legislation. This is an article in the Gleaner I found published in 1899 entitled Revivalism and Lunacy. It says that there was a 90% increase in the intake within lunatic asylums, right? The resolution taken by the St. Elizabeth Board was also taken by other parish councils across the island, which connected revivalism to lunacy. This quote taken from the Gleaner article by Dr. Plaxton in regards to addressing the notion whether revivalism contributed to lunacy. He says that that is a mistaken view, and this is a medical professional now. However, the masses of Jamaica have nothing to do to occupy their leisure except religious exercises. They do not, for the most part, read seriously, nor have they, as a rule, or any of those intellectual hobbies and recreations which the masses of England do. Religion is their pastime and their only mental pabulum. When therefore the mind gives way, whether from hereditary or other causes, the readiest form in which their insanity is expressed is in religious exercises. And this is another article with a minister of religion stating that, of course, lunacy in Jamaica was not attributing factor or a cause of revivalism. However, it was the drunkenness among the people that contributed to madness. However, there's another article by True Blue published in 1908 where he was refuting the medical report by Dr. Williams, and he called for an appeal because he was convinced that revivalism is a major cause of madness in Jamaica. And what you're looking at here is a report submitted to the colonial secretary in 1930, calling for the banning of revivalism on the grounds that it contributed to madness. And this is the same, one of the similar documents. Now, quickly, in terms of the Revivalism and Shakerism Prohibition Bill, there are certain clauses which were in that document. One is an offense to take part in revivalism meetings. Of course, offense for houses to be erected or maintained. There was the power given to police officers to enter revival spaces without a warrant. And of course, once you are convicted, there's a fine of £50. And of course, in default of payment, therefore of imprisonment with or without hard labor for 6 months. Thankfully, this bill was not passed within Parliament, right? But the consciousness of the people alluded to the ways in which African spirituality was viewed. And of course, this document shows where there were actually persons setting fire to the worship houses or booths of revivalists in Jamaica. So we have come a far way where these things are concerned. And I will end with these conclusions, that madness among Jamaicans is to a great degree attributed to historical trauma caused by the brutal system of slavery and colonization, which lasted for over 300 years. Madness, as we see in legislation and otherwise, was used as a tool of social and political control. The criminalization of African expressions was an attempt to eradicate black religious political movements that posed a threat to the state. And lastly, in examining madness as an embodied political form, the analysis must include the role of the spirit as an active agent of power among African Jamaicans. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Henry, for a very powerful, moving, informative presentation. Let's give him another round of applause. And I know that many of you online also enjoyed his presentation. We have just about 10 minutes for questions. So we will ask Dr. Henry to come back to the lectern to answer any of the questions or provide additional information.
Thank you, thank you.
All right, so I have a roving mic, and I already see Prof. Campbell and Ms. Smith in that order. So he has yielded to Ms. Smith.
Thank you, Prof. So I must say that this was a very informative research. I can see all of the parts that were endeavored in it. And on top of it too, learning about slavery has never been so engrossed in information. You know, when you learn about it in school, they kind of only skim over. And they just gloss over it, so you know you don't really get the idea of what happened. So I really want to thank you for opening our eyes and sharing information that we wouldn't readily know on a daily basis. I wanted to ask, do you believe, it's a two-part question, do you believe that we are becoming awakened by our programming of madness? And with that, what can be done now to assist with the decolonization of our minds from oppression?
Thank you. Those are thesis questions, of course. In terms of our outlook on madness, we have come a long way. So recently, I want to begin by saying that the ministry, the government, has put forward revivalism, well, the pilgrimage to Wat Town, which is a revival ritual, to be inscribed on UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage list. So there are currently steps being taken for the recognition of revivalism as an important religious expression within our society. There are certain narratives about revivalism that are changing. So once upon a time, you will hear that revivalists are largely working class people, illiterate, higglers, and so on. Today, that landscape is changing. You have, for example, me as a revivalist doing this presentation and so on. So the attitudes towards madness, those are changing, and we are seeing also the shift in terms of how we redefine madness. So currently, because of the works of particular scholars, we are actually calling for the continued advocacy on expressive forms like dancehall, reggae, which were once upon a time deemed as madness, you know, things within the margins of society. And today, Rastafari, reggae music have a global impact. So the society is changing. I hope I answered the question.
No, Doctor, and thank you very much for a very deep and, insightful presentation. I enjoyed it. I was listening to every word you said, yeah? I want to ask you about the manifestation of madness in contemporary society. I mean, from your experience, how is this madness, currently manifested in our society? And also, given the different experiences of slaves, you mentioned particularly the Jamaican slaves, in other parts of the Caribbean, would the manifestation of madness be a little bit different from your experience?
All right, that's an interesting question, and it goes to the heart of the research that I'm trying to do, right? Manifestations of madness. First up, we'll begin by saying that the identification, classification, and interpretation of madness was legally defined, not medically defined. So what the plantation masters did was to identify any bodily expression, whether drumming, dancing, speaking, which are other to their own culture. Those were classified as being mad, right? And so madness, in a way, as I mentioned, wasn't a medical matter per se. It was a legal matter to suppress and erase black expressive forms. And even in today's society, in contemporary society, we still, within our subconscious, view those cultural expressive forms which are African-derived as mad. We call dancehall vulgar. We, as I said before, once upon a time viewed Bob Marley himself, Rastafari, as mad. I mentioned the Coral Gardens massacre, and that was only because the Rastafari men and women of Coral Gardens weren't considered as serious citizens within society, but rather lunatics to be incarcerated and institutionalized. And of course, I mentioned the law which states that once you committed a felony within the colonial government, you were automatically sent to the lunatic asylum as a corrective measure. And of course, as you would imagine, which group of people? Yeah, the population, right? And so that was a strategy. But I'm arguing that within these expressions of so-called madness identified by the colonial master, we have owned our madness, yes? And continue to impact society and the world with our madness. Our Professor Frederick Hicklins has a book, Owning Your Madness, and he alludes to these very things, very same things. Dancehall is a global phenomenon. And I'm sure Carnival was, is classified as madness as well. Revivalism is a global phenomenon. Today, revivalism is practiced in countries such as Germany, Spain, North America, Europe, and so on. So there's a way in which we have owned our madness, celebrated our madness, and used our madness as a way of impacting the world in a positive way.
And just I wanted to get your impression of how Obia is currently being trivialized. You hear on political platforms, it's been used as a sort of gimmick, Does that in some way feed into this type of negative narrative towards the practice? Because I did see from your presentation, it's still legal. And then there is almost a repopularization of Obia. A lot of the people in scamming, for example, will tell you that, they practice Obia as part of their ritual, if you may, for their craft. So I wanted to get your impression on those two things, what do you see the impact of politicians sort of trivializing Obia, and also this emerging repopularization, if you may, of the practice where in a subgroup of society, it's not seen as a negative thing, but also as something, as a means to success.
All right. In my head, I'm mapping a sort of trajectory in looking at how obia from the West African word obi was derived. And within West African society, obia is used largely for healing purposes, right? And if you look, the 1760 Taki Rebellion, which resulted in the 1898 obia law, why was the obia law passed? The obia law was passed as a means to suppress rebellions, right? And we have to keep in mind that within every major religion in Jamaica, even up to the 1865 Paul Bogle Rebellion, spirituality was essential. It was recorded even Paul Bogle during the Mornby Rebellion did certain particular blood sacrifice to assist him, to call on the ancestors to help him, give him the spiritual strength to fight against the colonial masters. And of course, the colonial masters were quite threatened by this. So it was one thing that they couldn't put in chains, was the spirit of the people. And so they had to crush the spirit of the people, crush their religious expressions, is in a way to create docility among the plantations. And one way of doing it, well, is to pass legislation, of course, but the other way is to create stories around these particular religious groups. Yes, so now after the obia law, you start to hear that obia is madness, obia is superstition, obia is witchcraft. And Marky Obia, the obia man, as I pointed before, was doing healing within the society, and that is why the medical law of 1908 was passed, because the colonial masters were trying to suppress the obia men who were using folk medicine to restore and repair the health of the people and so on. Of course, unfortunately, obia has been popularized and distorted within our society today by virtue of the colonial narratives that we have of it. Of course, individuals throughout popular culture, whether it is for scamming or other means, have sought to tap into certain spiritualities, yes, which may not necessarily be obia, but again, the law did not specifically define what obia was. And so everything that we see as spirit, yes, as you beat a drum 2 times, as you wrap your head and go on the road, obia, right? As you light a candle, is obia. And granted, Roman Catholics light candles too. Roman Catholics do certain rituals too. Is that obia? Absolutely not. Yes, but again, it's a sort of racist approach to African spiritual expressions that remains in our society.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I know we have a lot more questions, but we have time for one more question.
Good day, Dr. Henry.
Good
How are
day,
you?
Etienne. I am well.
Good, nice. Insightful indeed. I want to point to the part of revivalism and madness where Christians, because you mentioned that revivalists use Christianity to disguise, right? If I'm right.
Yes.
Right. And now the Protestants don't view revivalism as Christianity, right? And as you said earlier on, they also akin it to Pocomania, say it is that you're one and the same. I was watching an interview the other day with a Jamaican actor who was a part of revivalism, said, and a question was asked if revivalism and Pocomania, he said they're kind of the same thing, they're pretty much the same thing. And Christians see revivalism also as madness. Protestants, even though a lot of them do the same thing. They sing the same songs, they speak in tongues, they get in spirit and do all sorts of things. But when revivalists do it, are mad people them.
Yes.
Is there any part of your research that highlights that disparity and why it would be that Protestants, I just mentioned about Catholics, they light candles, they do the same thing, but they see Obia and revivalism as something that is not within their scope, not a part of them, and pretty much infuriated.
Yes.
Is there anything in your research that speaks to Christians versus revivalists?
Well, in my thesis I mentioned it, but this paper is particularly for that purpose. You see, because of the internalized racism that Dr. Joy DeGruy talks about, there is a divide within the revivalist movement, you see, as to what is appropriate and what is not appropriate in terms of spirituality, right? So there is that to contend with. But for a long, let me just say also that pertaining to your question, Diane Austin Bruce's book, Jamaica Genesis, talks about the fact that a lot of these Protestant churches that we see in Jamaica actually emerge out of revivalism, right? And if you look at some of their services, manifestations, let me just use that word, quite similar to revivalism. I watched a video of an apostolic church, and the way they were stomping and using the hand movement and even wearing turbans and the wearing of white in particular. It's very reflective of revivalism. But I argue as a revivalist, and I'm in some sort of conflict with some of my brothers and sisters, that revivalism is not a Christian denomination, it's not a part of Christianity. Revivalism, proudly, is Jamaica's first religion, and it is the only religion, along with Rastafari, that started here in the island, and it is something that we ought to be proud of. So I won't push forward the narrative that revivalism is a denomination of Christianity. I think the origin of revival and revivalism's contribution to even nationalism is much larger than that, and we should own that. There's a way in which revivalism has, over the years, been used as entertainment. You know, when it comes on to supporting the ideologies of Rastafari or revival, persons are not easily likened to do that. But when you want, for example, a 9-night band to come and play, when you adopt a band, yes? When you want, for example, to watch a play on Pocomania, or when you want a revival group to come and do a presentation. So there's a way in which African expressions have been used as a kind of spectacle or amusement within society. For a long while, Rastafari was seen as a spectacle within our society, right? And one of my critiques about Brand Jamaica is that they continue to use Rastafari as that spectacle, the brand, but do they believe in the ideologies of Rastafari, right? So there are several things, issues to contend with within our society. So for me, revivalism is Jamaica's first religion. And it's a religion that allows us as black people to own ourselves. In fact, revivalism, with the base of African spirituality, believes in inclusivity. In revivalism, while the colonial churches were putting black people at the back and creating segregation and so on, revival groups were the only group of people that incorporated the East Indians who came, because the East Indians and Chinese did suffer under colonialism as well. And so in revivalism today, you will find elements of Hinduism, East Indian spirituality. You will find elements of Chinese spirituality and so on and so on. And it speaks to the kind of inclusive nature, the accommodative nature of revivalism within our society. I will end there. Doctor.
Wow.
Again, powerful being the adjective. We really want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule. You have shared a wealth of information. I mean, we could have gone on for another hour or two because it's only really time constraint, but we are very, very grateful. And we look forward to continuing supporting the research that you're doing. And we know that you're also working with many groups across the island. You're not just talking the talk. You're doing a lot of the work in the communities with many groups, and we want to encourage you to continue doing that. We didn't even get to ask you about the African-Caribbean Institute of Jamaica, Jamaica Memory Bank, because we know you're doing a lot of good work there. And we want to encourage you to continue. So once again, thank you, Dr. Henry. And thank you, audience. And we have a very live audience online who have also been very much engaged. And we want to thank you for viewing this very important lecture. So I move to express gratitude on behalf of the Office of the Campus Director. Professor Campbell is really serious about research, and let's give him a round of applause for starting the series, and we're going to continue to grow as we embark on this very exciting journey. There's so much work out there, and we at UWI-Mona Western Jamaica campus are serious about research and sharing that with the world. So I express gratitude to all of you who have participated in this very successful seminar. Please join us next week, April 24, for the 7th and final presentation of the research seminar series for this academic year. It will feature a presentation by Dr. Jennifer Stewart Dixon, when she will speak on the topic Strategic Considerations for Designing and Implementing Global Health Programs. Stay tuned and thank you.